What a lovely sunny day to be outside in spring. But all is not well in our natural world, despite, a few places of amazing beauty. Much of our landscapes in countries like the UK and beyond are very devastated by intensive agriculture, by development which doesn't really respect other species. And what we're seeing is a loss of biodiversity on a global scale, worse than any has been seen in hundreds of millions of years. Humans are creating biodiversity loss on a level of the 6th mass extinction. And it will have consequences, of course, for us in terms of our ability to provide food or provide environments where we can essentially survive. It's not an exaggeration to say that the basis of our civilization is at risk from our destruction of nature. So obviously there's a real challenge in terms of stepping up to address that nature crisis. Now, I think that a start is for us to realise the extent of nature's decline, but also, of course, not to become gloomy and apathetic about what we can do, because I believe genuinely that there are ways that we can be empowered to create action which can reverse this decline in nature. So the first step is to realise, that the air we breathe is not as clean as it was. The water that we drink and that we swim in is polluted and damaging to our health and damaging to the health of other species. Our soils are becoming exhausted and create problems in the way we can potentially grow food. Recognising these problems and the loss of nature around us, there are beautiful places, but actually we're far less likely to see the numbers of butterflies or birds that we were just 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. So this decline of nature is serious, and we need to step up and do something about it. There's a real risk that as the environmental crisis worsens, so the climate and the nature crisis worsens, we see what we might call vicious cycles, so things getting worse. This operates at an individual level. For example, when people feel separate from nature, they feel disconnected, because many towns and cities, we don't have abundant biodiverse green space, and so children often grow up feeling less connected to nature. It's less part of their identity, and that means they do less to protect nature. They're less likely to care for it and to stand up for it, and so we get a continued decline in nature. And so this vicious cycles kind of operates. They also operate at larger levels as well. For example, when we have worsening environmental crisis, we have scarcity of resources, and we see this in water resources around the world, energy resources, and we have individuals respond to that sense of scarcity. You've probably maybe familiar from the pandemic, where when there's a perceived scarcity of resources, like toilet rolls, how suddenly we see quite selfish behaviours of people accumulating those resources at the expense of others. People walking down shopping supermarkets with trolleys full of toilet roll, when key workers, nurses, ambulance staff are at work, and they come into the shops and there's no of the resources that they need. And we see this happening at the national scale as well, where countries pull up the borders. They say, our country first, and withdrawing from international agreements to be able to better manage the environment. And of course, trying to manage water resources, trying to protect biodiversity, prevent ocean acidification, prevent climate change, all these require close international cooperation. And when we have this survival of the fittest mentality, this kind of pull up the hatches and kind of batten down and look after ourselves, we actually create a race to the bottom, and then a vicious cycle emerges. So I hope I don't paint a $2 picture, but I think we need to have our eyes open about the reality of the crisis that we face. So how do we think about solutions to this decline of nature and the wider environment? Well, there are a number of types of solutions out there, and some of these solutions rely on technological innovation. Now, of course, there's a role for technology, but I think often it's seen as a kind of silver bullet, and there's a lot of wishful thinking around technology. So, for example, in our landscapes, beyond this lovely bluebell field are some intensive fields, and many of those fields don't have the resources for pollinators, for our hoverflies, for our bees, and so we've seen a continued decline in those species over time. Now that threatens our ability to grow crops like strawberries, tomatoes, raspberries, apples, and that threatens our food security. So as a solution, some innovators have talked about creating robotic pollinators. So these are small drones that can fly around greenhouses, and they can pollinate tomato crops. And you know, they're getting better every day. These drones can fly around, they're controlled by a central computer, and they can pollinate those crops inside these long polytunnels. But the problem is, those robotic drones aren't going to be able to pollinate the hundreds of thousands of different wildflower plants that we have. And so if we focus only on that technological innovation, a very narrow solution to one type of crop, we have opportunity costs in terms of protecting wild pollinators. And if we lose the bees and the hoverflies, we lose all the wildflower plants. And if we lose all those species, essentially, you know, our human civilization would struggle to survive. So there's real costs of focusing on these technofixes. Another example is these technological innovations to address climate crisis. So, for example, we know the climate's warming, and people suggest, well, let's think about this. Maybe we could put mirrors in space to reflect the Earth's sunlight back. Or maybe we could put lots of iron filings, dump them in the sea, and then we'll get phytoplankton growing, and they'll absorb the carbon as they grow. Or maybe we could fly planes all around the planet, and we can seed clouds, and those clouds will reflect more sunlight, and so we'll have a cooling effect. But all these solutions, they're hugely risky for a start. You know, they're very likely to disrupt whole weather patterns across the planet and lead to more geopolitical disruption, affecting, you know, the ability of farmers to harvest in different places of the world. And equally, they just kick the can down the road because, for example, politicians can say, oh, okay, we don't need to reduce carbon emissions as much now. We can just, you know, wait for these inventions to come along and put those in place. And in fact, worryingly, all our scenarios for, you know, 1.5 degrees of global warming, all those scenarios are based on a technology of capturing carbon and storing it underground. And actually, this technology is as yet untested at scale. So we haven't even got this technology yet, and yet the scenarios of 1.5 degrees all rely on them. So if we don't have those technologies, we're on track for much higher warming. And so there's a real danger of the false sense of security that these techno-fixes give us. The other type of solution is economic solutionism. And, you know, this, for example, is one approach here is that we quantify the value of nature. And we, for example, quantify different habitat types and different species, and we can even put a monetary value on them. And then we can feed them into our economic systems, and in theory, our financial systems, in theory, those systems will work in a way which doesn't destroy nature. But this, again, is hugely risky in terms of creating these large markets for nature. And we know these big global open markets are very susceptible to financial speculation and foul play, which leads to market failures. But also, at the fundamental level, there are side effects. You know, by treating nature as an asset, as a lifeless asset that's out there that we can objectify and quantify, we create a sense of disconnection between ourselves and nature. But actually, you know, that's not the only way to have a relationship, that kind of utilitarian, transactional relationship. You know, if you think about your family, you know, I think about my family, I don't have a transactional relationship with my children. I see them as part of my identity. And as a consequence of that, I have a sense of care and duty and responsibility. My pets, you know, I see as a part of the family, and I have that sense of responsibility. If we can extend that sense of kinship of family to wider nature, then we can, well, the research shows, hundreds of papers now in journals in fields like environmental psychology show that when we have that sense of identity, where we see nature as part of ourselves, we're much more likely to care, to recycle more, to reduce our carbon footprint, to volunteer for environmental causes. And so we see that sense of agency and empowerment, which, coming back to the economic solutions, those economic solutions that treat nature as an asset absolutely undermine that sense of nature to being part of us. And instead they undermine that social norm of looking after nature for the right reason and make it all about looking after nature because we'll get paid for it. So I think there's real limitations to these types of solutions, and actually many science policy agencies around the world. So these are organisations like the UN Development Programme, the UN Environment Programme, the European Environment Agency, credible bodies, numerous reports now coming out talking about how technological fixes, how economic fixes are, they're necessary aspects of solutions, but they're not sufficient. We need to go deeper. We need to get down to the root causes of why we're destroying nature. And according to one major report that 147 governments have ratified, and this is from an organisation called, slightly wordly, the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. So they do what IPCC does for the climate, big global assessments of trying to understand what's happening to nature and what we can do about it. And this report says, ratified by 150 countries, that the root cause of our destruction of nature is a sense of disconnection and domination over nature, along with a sense of short-termism and imbalances in power and wealth. Now, all these factors are related to our culture, to our mindsets. And so, according to IPBES and these other science policy agencies now reaching consensus, we need this deeper shift in culture. We really need to think about changing our mindsets, our worldviews, by which we see ourselves, our identity, our relationship to nature, our place in the world. And collectively, that means transforming our culture. And only then when we really get at the root causes of these problems and when we see meaningful change. And that meaningful change then can cascade up and change the way we form our economic and technological solutions as well. So I want to come to this point about our relationship with nature, because saying that we're connected with nature, we are one with nature, many religions have been saying the same, religions around the world. Many philosophers have been, from Spinoza to many other writers, talking about that oneness with nature. But actually, it's not something we just need to be told the way it is. Modern science is also showing that that's absolutely a fact, really. And the way many indigenous cultures around the world, obviously diverse cultures that live very differently, from Maori to Inuit to the Quechua to the Nguni Buntu in Africa, many different cultures also have a way of seeing nature which is very seeing it as part of an ancestor, being part of our kin. And actually that worldview is supported by modern science. So science is fully commensurate with this idea that religions and philosophers and indigenous cultures talk about, that nature is part of us. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. If we think about who am I? Who am I? That fundamental question. We can think about our physical bodies to start with. We used to think for hundreds of years that our physical bodies were built from a balance of 4 humours, they were called. And this is probably because when blood is kept in a vial, it separates into 4 layers. And these 4 humours were thought to determine someone's personality. So yellow bile, black bile, blood and phlegm. And these humours were thought to reflect someone's personality. Now, if we fast forward to our modern understanding of the body, we can actually see that that's not the case. But actually the true nature of what our body is actually, you know, I'd say much more fascinating than that. So for example, if you take the body and you break down the body into its constituent elements, what we find is we're mostly oxygen, carbon, hydrogen and nitrogen, and these elements are what make up everything else in the world. And there are a few trace elements of mercury and arsenic, a few exciting things, but we're pretty much at the base level mostly oxygen, to be fair. 60% of our bodies are oxygen. The reason we don't all float around, which would be quite fun, but the reason we don't is that oxygen is bound together with hydrogen, and the dense intermolecular forces of that H2O, that water, keeps our body grounded. But when we die, when our bodies decay, if we're cremated or buried, then those bonds break and those molecules start to spread around into the wider world. So actually, let's just think of that for a moment. If we think of all the oxygen in your body, those 40 kilograms that are in our body right now, if we think of that oxygen as we decay and die, the oxygen molecules that are in my body are going to spread out. Let's say they're going to spread out amongst this woodland, they're going to creep up the boles of the trees, they're going to spread out of the woodland, of the canopy, and around into the atmosphere of the world. Imagine that in your body right now, all those 40 kilograms of oxygen molecules spread out. And they're going to spread around the entire planet. So 100 kilometers high, all around the entire world. So a question I want to ask you is, how far apart would those molecules of oxygen be? So they were in your body 40 kilograms, and now they're spread around the entire planet. And it turns out that those molecules of oxygen, if they were spread equally around the Earth's atmosphere, they would be 0.3 millimeters apart from each other on average. So you could take 1 meter cubed of oxygen from anywhere, 87 kilometers above Beijing, and you could take 1 meter and there'd be 27 million molecules of oxygen that were once in your body, and that's mingling with a dense fog of molecules that were once part of other animals, of wallabies, of whales, of shrews, of walruses, of ants, dinosaurs. When you take a deep breath, you're breathing in a zoological legacy, and obviously we're incorporating those molecules into our body. So even though our bodies are made of what might sound like boring elements, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, our bodies are made from countless bodies before us, from the material of countless bodies before us. And when we decay, we will become part of countless bodies beyond us. And actually, our bodies also are not even fully human as well. So inside our body, we have 37 trillion cells, human cells, but we also have about the same number of bacterial cells. These bacterial cells occur all over our skin, about 450 in our elbow joints, about 1,000 in our mouths, 125 species of bacteria behind your ears, depending on how often you wash. And these bacteria, obviously in our guts, inside our bodies as well, they're inside our guts. You've probably read, I imagine, how the microbiome, the gut bacteria, and also the fungi as well, incidentally, inside our bodies, inside our guts, for example, influence our emotions, influence our moods, and ultimately determine our personalities, how well we concentrate, how anxious we are, how much energy we have, how happy we are. And so, again, these detract from our supposed autonomy. We're not isolated, separated individuals. When we think who we are, who am I? I'm not this separate, atomized entity that my culture might tell me I am. I'm deeply connected. I'm like a chimera of human and non-human cells. In fact, even my human cells, every human cell has what's in it called mitochondria. These are tiny little powerhouses that create the energy by which we all move around. And those mitochondria were once free-living organisms which were engulfed by another cell, and that became the progenitor of animal cells. So even our human cells are actually a chimera of human and non-human. And so our bodies are deeply connected with the world around us. we have energy flowing through us and materials flowing through us and past us. So what is it that makes it me when I look in the mirror? You might ask. Well, the thing that makes our bodies have some continuousness over time is our DNA, our genetic code, and that is building the structure of the body that looks like me, that looks like you. So that DNA is working with materials that have been scavenged from the environment, that once part of other organisms, and it's building this body that looks fairly continuous, albeit with gradual signs of aging over time. But actually, when you think about that DNA is just borrowed from our ancestors, and we'll pass it on to our ancestors to come. So, for example, actually, the DNA as well in our bodies doesn't always just pass vertically through the tree of life. It sometimes passes horizontally. So viruses can actually vector, they can carry DNA between organisms. And so the tree of life is not with species as these distinct isolated tips. Actually, it's more like a tangled web. And genes transmit horizontally as well. So of our 20,000 human genes, around 120 or so were thought to have jumped sideways across the tree of life. One is an example is the gene for placenta development in mammals in humans actually came from rabbit populations, and that gene was carried by a virus and now structures the placenta in humans. So our DNA is, we're actually part of like a cut and paste from the web of life. Our DNA is just borrowed from our ancestors. We're similar, we're 99.9% similar in DNA to each other. But equally, we're 30%, a third of our DNA is similar to a simple bacteria. The same DNA, the same code. So we're like a cut and paste from the web of life, deeply connected to each other. Okay, so I asked who am I, who are we? Our physical bodies, we're not these isolated entities. We built from energy that is just scavenged from the world around us, from DNA which is borrowed from our ancestors. There's nothing that makes a discrete, isolated entity. But then we might say, okay, what about our minds? Because that's what makes me, and that's what determines this personality over time. But actually, every word that you hear, every touch, even every smell, structures the connections. The 150 billion neurons that are in your brain are changing all the time, the connections. Hundreds and thousands of connections made every second. And those connections constantly being reconfigured into our environment. The things that I hear, the birdsong that I hear, the voices that we talk to each other are continually restructuring our brains, and we're forming each other's minds all the time. And as I said, even smells. So there's some lovely experiments you can do where we look at the effects of pheromones. So pheromones are smell chemicals. You can put a t-shirt on someone and put them in a stressful situation. So, for example, you throw them out of an aeroplane with these t-shirts on, ideally with a parachute. And when they land, you take these t-shirts that they've been sweating in and this fear treatment. But then you also have a control. So you put the same type of t-shirt on someone else who's in they're sweating, they're in the gym, they're listening to Bon Jovi. So they're sweating, but they're kind of happy. I mean, as much as you can be, in a gym listening to Bon Jovi. But we have these two treatments. One had fear imposed and one didn't. The shirts look the same, they both smell mildly sweaty. But you put these shirts on a mannequin. This is the type of mannequin that dentists practice their dental surgery on. And it turns out that the shirts have been exposed to the fear chemicals, the skydivers. The dentists make more mistakes on their surgery when they're exposed to those chemicals. So fear and anxiety are contagious through pheromones that we can transmit into the air around us. But actually, more recent research is showing that happiness as well are all also contagious and transmitted in pheromones. And our natural environment, the smells of trees, the smells of flowers, of the animals around us, also structure and affect our sense of anxiety or peace or calmness. And so all the time our environment is in structuring our brain. I'll just give, so I guess I've talked about our bodies and who we are and our minds from a very biology perspective. cell biology, evolutionary biology, neuroscience. The science of social networks, social sciences, is also breaks down the idea that we're these separate entities, because we interact in these social networks, and actually up to 3 links away, people you've never met in these social networks can influence your voting preferences, your risk of obesity, your taste in music. So all around us, we're being influenced by other people that we've never even met through those interactions. And this web of connections really spreads across the whole planet. I'm just going to give one last example from a human side of this, debunking this idea that we're these lone individuals. If you think of inventors, think of an inventor, and I think often we have this image that inventors are these kind of lone wolves working away in sheds. But actually, telephone, hypodermic needle, steamboat, light bulb, all these inventions actually were invented in multiple places around the planet. Sometimes at the same time, the telephone patents lodged on the same day in different countries. So really this idea that inventors are these lone wolves, they are great minds, but the reality is there's a whole kind of river of culture ready to birth these innovations, and if it wasn't this person at this particular place at this point in time, it would be this other person eventually, pretty soon, likely. So the whole body of our culture also reflects how minds are work in a collective way. So this idea that we're separate individuals, we're isolated individuals, is not true. When we ask who we are, we're deeply connected to each other and the world around us. And this worldview is very important. Our cultures might tell us differently. Our modern Western cultures certainly tell us differently. Our education systems telling us to, build self-esteem, build a personal brand. This idea that, build a personal brand. If we're deeply connected to each other and also changing all the time, this idea of trying to create some kind of static personal brand is, of course, going to create cognitive dissonance and cause anxiety. We're affected by advertising, telling us that we're worth it and we deserve things. We're influenced by government. In the UK, we had Margaret Thatcher telling us there's no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. So all these factors, our education systems, our governments, our media, they create a cultural environment that our brains soak up like a sponge, and it's telling us that we're separate, that we're isolated, that we're competing, that we're individuals. But the science is really suggesting that all that is a myth. It's an illusion. And it's an illusion that is partly adaptive. We need a sense of self. I'm not saying we don't. We need a sense of self to gather food, to understand our complex social networks. And that's why we evolved a sense of self. But there are things where traits can evolve, but they can become exacerbated by our culture and pushed to an extent which is unhelpful. So, for example, let's think of our passion for eating sugary or fatty foods. Actually, it was a trait that evolved because those types of food were very scarce in certain in environments where we evolved, and so it was adaptive to seek them out. But in the modern world, we have those foods in abundance. In fact, it's hard sometimes to buy something in a town that isn't sugary or fatty or salty, etc. And our media advertising is pushing those foods on us. They're cheaper, etc. And this creates an environment which exacerbates this evolved trait and pushes it further along the road, so that we actually eat too much of those foods. And the consequences ultimately is that of the world's 8 billion people, 2 billion are overweight or obese. Incidentally, while 2 billion are also malnourished. So really we create this problem, and it's partly because we have a trait which has evolved, but our culture, rather than controlling those traits, has pushed it in the wrong direction and made those unhealthy foods too available. So if we come back to our sense of identity now, yes, we need a sense of self. It evolved. It's important to have one. But if we take it to it's the extreme, and our culture exacerbates that sense of atomized individualism, then actually that becomes maladaptive. It becomes problematic. And it pushes us to become selfish. It pushes us to create systems, economic systems, which destroy nature around us. And this is bringing this back now to how do we address these systems? The root cause, it comes down to those mindsets. So really, the science is telling us that we're deeply connected to each other. Many philosophies and religions and other older indigenous cultures have told us that as well. And when we can start to absorb these lessons and really shift that sense of identity back to what we used to be in terms of much more interwoven sense of identity with the natural world around us, then we can get at the root cause of these problems. I talked about those big global problems, climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, and they seem so daunting, but I think it's empowering to think some of the solutions lie within us. Now, sometimes people say, well, hold on, don't put it down on all of us individual people. It's also those big companies, the executives of those oil companies that are destroying the world. And that's true. And those are just people as well. And if we can change their mindsets, if we can change our wider culture and shift those mindsets, then we can start to transform those organizations. And we can also think about ways that our mindsets cascade upwards to create those structural changes. So in organizations, maybe there's new ways we can think about organizational culture. Can we think about the way we make decisions, taking people outside to make decisions, putting nature on the board so nature has a voice represented in those processes? What about our legal systems? We've given personhood rights to corporations. Maybe we should recognize the intrinsic value of nature, give personhood rights to rivers or mountains. A movement, incidentally, which is happening in many places around the world already. So there are ways that we can think about our structures, our organizations, our legal systems, our finance systems, in ways that we adopt what I might call a more nature-centric philosophy, where we reject the anthropocentrism that sees humans as exceptional at the top of this pyramid of life, but we see ourselves more enmeshed as part of that deeper web of life. And we have that humility where we see ourselves on a par with the value of these other species. And then we think about the technologies and the economic systems that flow from that different worldview. And maybe then we can create structures that repair and heal the planet. So I hope you've enjoyed the ideas here. I hope you think about ways that you can maybe help with the transformation of mindsets and catalyse new structures and ways of restoring this beautiful planet around us.